history, language, culture, mentality. Experts, activists, and concerned citizens' opinions on what it means to be a Belarusian. Identity.
This is Identity Project on the waves of Radio Belarus International. In it, we'll try to present an understanding of the Belarusian national idea by historians, state, civil, military, religious, and cultural agents of Belarus, as well as ordinary citizens of the country. Arsienij is at the mic for you. We continue our conversation with the Deputy Director for Research at the Institute of Philosophy at the National Academy of Sciences of Belarus, Philosophy Dr. Andrej Dudčyk. Today we will learn how the Belarusian philosophical thought was formed, how it looks today, and what role it plays in the formation of identity.
Identity.
Андрей Юрьевич, давайте обратимся к истокам.
Let us turn to the origins of Belarusian philosophical thought. What traditions shaped it?
Несмотря на то, что профессиональная философия у нас...
Despite the fact that professional philosophy appears in our country only recently, the origins of philosophy are quite old. We can talk about the thousand-year-old tradition of intellectual culture. Those traditions include Christian theology, political and legal teachings, and debates between representatives of various denominations. Finally, in the 16th century, academic philosophy as scholasticism appears in our region. This may be considered the beginning of professional philosophy in Belarus.
Появилась национальная философия.
When does national philosophy appear? I mean those thinkers who talk about Belarusians, about the rise of national self-awareness. And was the Soviet period influential in this respect?
Если говорить о национальной философии...
If we talk about the philosophy that brings questions about national identity, about the national purpose of Belarusians to the foreground, then we should recall the National Renaissance Project. It comes at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, when these issues begin to be comprehended on a theoretical level. Indeed, there was a Marxist influence, or even wider, the influence of socialist ideas. In particular, there was a cooperative movement. A number of Belarusian thinkers, which we will talk about later, were carried away by these ideas and even considered the cooperative movement as some ideal form of self-organization of Belarusian society. There is an interesting feature about the Soviet version of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. The first textbook in the Soviet Union on it was published in Minsk. Semyon Volson lectured on dialectical materialism in 1922 and published his lectures. Although it is worth saying that this textbook was quite far from the canon of Soviet philosophy, which was formed later and with which the older generation might be familiar. Nevertheless, the Belarusian philosophers were pioneers in this respect.
Но именно вот в советский период вот это вот...
But precisely in the Soviet period, did Marxism supplant national themes?
Понятно, что в Советском Союзе было свое представление.
It's a difficult question. The Soviet Union had its own idea what the national philosophy is, what issues it should deal with. By the way, it was believed that each Soviet republic should have its own philosophical tradition, so they looked for authors who could be called spontaneous materialists or atheists retrospectively. Nevertheless, the National Philosophy Project is shaped back then. During the Soviet period, a number of works on the history of Belarusian philosophy were published. A number of texts that we use today have been translated. That is, in this regard, everything was not as clear as it might seem at first glance.
А что представляет из себя сегодня белорусская философия?
What is Belarusian philosophy today? Is it more national or Soviet or maybe something completely different?
Давайте начнем, может быть, с каких-то таких институтов.
Let's start with some institutional things. I can tell you what Belarusian philosophy is and in what centers it is implemented. This is, first of all, the Institute of Philosophy of the Belarusian National Academy of Sciences, where I work. Then there is the Department of Philosophy and Social Sciences. This year it celebrates its 30th anniversary, although the tradition of training philosophers has older roots. Since 1952, more than 1,000 doctoral and master's theses in philosophy have been defended in Belarus. Until recently, a general philosophy course was also taught at most universities and other higher educational institutions. So, philosophy is institutionalized, though the situation could have been better. In Slovakia, for example, which is comparable to Belarus in terms of population, there are 9 philosophical departments where professional philosophers are trained. At the moment, we have only 1 department at BSU. It seems to me that the topics that contemporary philosophers research are not even Soviet or national, but universal. Philosophy is a kind of knowledge that gravitates towards universality. Philosophers in different countries and different traditions deal with similar issues. In this regard, Belarus is included in the global philosophical process. In Soviet times, there was a strong tradition of philosophy of science. Research in this area continues to this day. A distinctive feature today is an interest in ecology and the development of social ecology. This is partly due to the consequences of the Chernobyl accident. Among traditional topics is an interest in the history of philosophy, which is the basis of philosophical education in most countries. We are beginning to pay more attention to the history of Belarusian philosophy, although interest in classical works is also present. There is a relatively new project, ethno-philosophy. Starting this year, they begin to implement it at our institute. It is associated with the study of traditional Belarusian culture, folklore, pre-literate forms of culture. Professional philosophers and experts from other fields are trying to find philosophical content there.
Возвращаясь к вопросу о факультете философии,
When I talked to Veronika Sayhanova, head of the Department of Philosophy of Culture, she said that the fact that we have only one philosophical educational institution is more related to the peculiarity of the profession. You took Slovakia as an example because it is comparable with Belarus in terms of population. There are 9 universities there. We've got 1. Why do you think there is such a big gap?
Возможно, это связано со спецификой нашего рынка труда.
Perhaps this is due to the specifics of our labor market. It is assumed that graduates should work in the professional field, and that's not always easy. It is either to be a teacher of philosophy or to be a researcher. On the other hand, many of my classmates work quite successfully in other areas: IT, marketing, business, public office, and so on. One can look at the profession more broadly. After studying at the philosophy department, simply well-educated people can find themselves in various fields. Many Western politicians and statesmen have a classical humanitarian education. It can be philosophy, history, etc.
Identity.
Identity Project is on the waves of Radio Belarus International. Arsienij Anderson is at the mic for you. We're talking about Belarusian philosophy with Andrej Dudčyk.
Identity.
Вы могли бы назвать какие-то имена?
Could you name the most important names in national philosophy? Those people who brought the most to the national idea.
Если говорить не столько даже вот о национальной философии.
I can name Andrej Volan. This is an author who dealt with political legal issues. He wrote about freedom, about the forms of government. One can recall the well-known Angel Dovgird, who combined theological ideas with the philosophy of empiricism. A native of the Belarusian lands, Solomon Maimon moved to Germany, being already at a fairly mature age. He was known as the man who entered into discussion with Immanuel Kant, and Kant himself highly appreciated his philosophical knowledge. In the 19th century, one can recall Alexander Arhamako, the inspector of the Polotsk Cadet Corps, who also wrote works on philosophy and was an inventor. He too had works devoted to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. There are a lot of names. If we focus on national thought, we should name Ignat Konchevsky or his wider-known pseudonym Jermalovič. In his famous work, The Eternal Path, he formulates important ideas for understanding the Belarusian path, which are elaborated on to this day. He considers Belarus as a culture located between the East and the West, which gravitates to one or the other pole but cannot make a final choice. Though this is not required, Jermalovič believes that Belarusians should not definitely choose one or the other way. He offers a way of social creativity, of what is called pouring forms as a variant of self-organization for Belarusian society. Another important cultural figure is Vladimir Samoyla, who lived in western Belarus in the 1920s. He has a famous work, You Will Win With This, where he formulates a strategy for the Belarusian national movement. In the Soviet period, there was a large figure, Vyacheslav Stupin, an academic at the Russian Academy of Sciences, a researcher originally from Belarus. He's known for his achievements in the field of philosophy philosophy of science. This is precisely the tradition that is strong in Belarus today.
В первую очередь Минская методологическая.
You are talking about the Minsk Methodological School.
У Степина, в общем-то, было достаточно большое количество.
Yes, there is such a term, already quite established. Stopin had a fairly large number of students who developed his ideas in various fields. So this direction is really a school, in my opinion.
Вообще не очень популярна у широкого.
I understand that academic philosophy is not very popular among a wide audience. Nevertheless, in your opinion, is knowledge of some basic philosophical ideas important for the perception of national idea? The same question for national philosophy, if there are related non-academic texts.
Соглашусь с тем, что академическая философия не очень
I
интересна.
do not quite agree that academic philosophy is not very interesting for a wide audience. When I communicate with strangers, I do not like to introduce myself as a professional philosopher because often they ask many questions. Seriously speaking, philosophy is primarily a culture of rational thinking, and it is important for any nation. The scientific and technological development that most countries in the world strive for is impossible without philosophical thinking. Naturally, this is not the basis of scientific and technological development, but it is such a specialty, spice, seasoning, which gives a certain tint to this development. It is no coincidence that today in many modern technical universities, humanitarian subjects and philosophy are paid a lot of attention to, because they understand that without studying philosophy, it's difficult to train a good specialist in the field of engineering, natural sciences, or IT. An important role of philosophical knowledge is forecasting the future. Philosophy offers possible scenarios for future development. Not all of them are realized, but philosophy still offers the opportunity to take a glance into the future. A large number of ethical problems that arise in modern society are associated with the latest technology development. For example, the introduction of robots in our daily lives. The question immediately arises: if the robot driver bumps into someone, who should be responsible? And so on. These are all philosophical questions. And it seems to me that the philosophical component is very important for the Belarusian identity. Often, when we talk about it, we touch primarily on the emotional layer, an area of emotions, feelings, collective experiences. A rational, sober view on the part of philosophy will be appropriate.
Как вы считаете, язык вообще важен для национальной философии?
Do you think language is important for national philosophy? Were there any languages other than Belarusian in Belarusian philosophical tradition?
Один из ключевых вопросов, на самом деле, для современных философских.
This is one of the key issues for contemporary philosophical discussions. On the one hand, philosophy claims to be a kind of universal knowledge, which to a lesser extent depends on some cultural, national features. Even if you look at the philosophy language, it is largely based on Latin or ancient Greek terms. There is commonality for different languages. On the other hand, there are different national linguistic traditions. There is a project, the European Dictionary of Non-Translatables, in the framework of which philosophers from different countries write articles about various important philosophical concepts in their languages, and they show that there is no direct correspondence between them. Each concept has its own history, its own cultural context. Language is, of course, important, but if we talk about the Belarusian philosophical tradition, this will not be the only or even the major attribute of this philosophy, because many thinkers and texts are characterized by bilingualism or even multilingualism. If we look at history from this angle, then the Belarusian will not even prevail there. Other languages were also used. Many texts were written in Latin, which was the language of philosophy, science, and intercultural communication. For a long time, Polish and Russian dominated. It seems to me that Belarusian philosophy should not be reduced to philosophy in Belarusian. It will not be entirely correct historically.
Последний вопрос. Вот лично для вас, что такое быть белорусом?
What does it mean for you to be a Belarusian?
Я на самом деле достаточно давно к нему обращаюсь.
Very interesting question. In fact, I have been addressing it for quite some time, and at different periods of my life, my scientific biography, I had different answers. Over time, I began to understand that it may be more important not just to talk about some theoretical formulations or beautiful slogans, although those may also be needed. In my opinion, regular daily work is equally important. I should refer to the researcher Michael Billig, who introduces the concept of banal nationalism. To mitigate, we can say banal national identity. The thought boils down to the fact that belonging to a particular nation is determined not so much by declarations and statements, but by painstaking daily work. It may be more important than the more intelligible formulations of what it means to be a Belarusian. I am beginning to understand that for me to be a Belarusian means living in my own country, working for the good of the society to which I belong, and contacting other Belarusians.
То есть национальная идентичность это больше...
That is, national identity is more about what needs to be done than what is already there.
То есть это же во многом от нас зависит, это не то, что предопределено.
Yes, because the meaning depends on us. This is not what is already predetermined. It cannot be said that a person was born or became a Belarusian or representative of any other national group. This is work. I think about my belonging to the Belarusian culture when I communicate with people from other countries. Some things that seem obvious to us may be strange to others. This difference allows you to feel your belonging.
Свою принадлежность к белорусскому обществу.
Большое спасибо за беседу.
Спасибо за интервью.
Identity.
The second and last part of the conversation with Andrej Dudčyk now ends. Today we talked about Belarusian philosophy. In future issues, we will discuss in more detail the role of language in the formation of identity with philologists and sociologists. You can listen to this and other programs at our YouTube channel, Cultural Panorama of Radio Belarus. Anytime, anywhere. Arsienij Anderson was with you. See you in a week.
History, language, culture, mentality. Experts, activists, and concerned citizens' opinions on what it means to be a Belarusian. Identity.